you to Peter and the organizing committee for putting together a great conference. It's a beautiful location. It's great to see sort of the data engineering profession sort of build and grow and evolve. It's quite different than 20 years ago when I started, and people sort of looked at me like I was crazy when I said, hey, we need to actually pay attention to the way we manage our data. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is applying engineering methodologies to data. And really the thing that Joe said earlier today that I'm not sure I agree with is that we're engineers, so we want to get to tools and just want to get into things. There's actually disciplines of engineering that that I think we can apply to data to drive broader, more systematic outcomes and really drive trust in information so that people can make better decisions. And so I'm going to draw on my engineering experience and describe some of the engineering tools that I see that we can apply in our day-to-day lives to help build trust in data and drive better decisions and value for our customers and our clients and our ecosystems. So I've got a line up there which is turning ones and zeros into high-value data products using continuous improvement methodologies. And so I broke those into 3 lines. As an engineer, I like to break things into their constituent parts and make sure that I understand what we mean by each of them. And so it should be no surprise to anybody in this room that we're dealing with ones and zeros, and we're turning them into helping people turn them into decisions by creating high-value data products. That's fundamentally what we're doing. There's a lot of stuff that goes in between those two states, and where I want to spend some time, and Joe talked about lean, but what I sort of describe as continuous improvement principles, which is just the fundamentals of lean or total quality management or Six Sigma, or some of those data engineering disciplines that we can apply to the tech field in a meaningful way. So, that didn't work. Let me try again. Okay. So engineering trust in data is more relevant than ever. And so the thing that I think is important for us to recognize is that it's not just about moving data from A to B. It's not just about creating value. It's about building the trust in that whole ecosystem and process so that as people become reliant on these data products that we build, they're more and more capable of taking advantage of that information. And as we think about the future and sort of the massively changing world, what can we do with information and data to help have an impact in the way we want to do things? And so I actually want us to do a little bit of, take a step back and think about the last time you were at a dinner party or a social event and you said, hey, and somebody asked you what you did for a living and you said, oh, I'm a data engineer. And their eyes glazed over and maybe they changed the subject, or even worse, they said, oh, you work in IT, can you fix my phone? So what I want to try and do today is leave you with something else to talk about in terms of the data engineering profession. In terms of the data engineering profession that's a little bit more exciting at a dinner party or a social event. And how you can apply sort of a wider range of engineering capabilities to the work that you do each day. And part of the reason I think that's important is because if we're thinking about building trust in data, if we're able to describe it in ways that are meaningful socially or meaningful to our business teams or our collaborators or our sponsors or our customers, we can potentially get more budget or more resources to build the kind of systems and processes that build the trust in data that we think is important, and ultimately our customers think is important too. But we want to sort of build the tools and the toolkit to enable you to do that today. So what I want to do is fix this problem where you get invited to a dinner party and you're the person that's not very happy to be there. So I want to make us more relevant in our dinner party conversations. And I'm going to do that by leaning hard into the data plumbing analogy. And if you say you're a data plumber, I don't think it's going to help you anymore, because when somebody says they're a plumber, the only response you get at a dinner party is, can you fix my toilet? And so the but I do think it's an apt analogy, and I think it's an interesting way of thinking about the ecosystem that we're working in and the maturity of the ecosystem. And so Joe was talking about sort of it's a relatively immature ecosystem. I've been doing it for 20 years, not quite as long as Alnus and Kowal, but been in the industry for a long time. And I've always sort of approached it from an engineering perspective, and only more recently have I started to see the market respond to that concept. And I want to share with you some of the things that I'm thinking and seeing. And so what we think about, and so the way I've kind of been thinking about the data plumbing analogy is the plumbing is sort of the ecosystem we have inside of our homes, right? So we're building our data pipelines for our organizations, for our customers, for our partners, inside of our own homes. But when I think about sort of continuous improvement and sort of the information we need in the world to address some of those sort of existential challenges we're facing, not only do we need to share data effectively inside of our homes or inside of our organizations and houses, we also have to start thinking about how we share data externally to sort of address some of the existential challenges. And so one of the things we're working on are sort of carbon tracing and sort of world sort of data exchanges. And what was happening there is people are talking about capturing scope 1, scope 2 emissions, which is a relatively simple problem. It's actually quite complex when you get into it. But scope 3, which is all of your downstream and upstream carbon impacts, trying to track that as an organization and share that out externally is going to be a massive data challenge and a massive data sharing challenge. And so one of the things I want us to start thinking about is how do we go from being data plumbers and data pipeline managers for our organizations, and then think about how we move that out into the public domain and share that. And more importantly, and where I think we can start building sort of the case for our profession and our domain is if we can outcompete, if we can help our organizations outcompete with data, then the change that we're making or the impacts that we're having can have an outsized effect as well. We are the engineers who have really large levers with machine learning and AI to make significant impacts in the world. And so the thing that I want to add to that, or the thinking, is industrial engineering. And so that's the practice of the engineering practice associated with lean, operations research, continuous improvement, quality, Six Sigma, all of those things that sort of, it's a known religion. So we had a question before about, are there going to be certifications for data, or the data engineering practice? My view is we probably will. I agree with Joe that we've got to be careful about those things because we don't want to have a one-size-fits-all model, but we need to start building on some first principles. And it's interesting, I've got a slide later which is almost, looks quite a bit different, but quite similar to Joe's slide about the basic fundamentals of what data engineering is. And so we need to start building that language consistently as an industry to start being able to have those kinds of certifications and those sort of, we have engineering in our title, but we don't have professional engineers the way we do in civil engineering or industrial engineering. And so I think data engineers can bridge that gap between what do I think about in terms of the internal data that we're building for our organizations and building trust in that internal data, and then bridging that out into the public sphere and the public domain to build trust externally. And so I'm going to sort of lean on that analogy a little bit as we go forward. So I want to take a few steps back. I want to take you back to sort of my origin story and sort of what I imagined I'd be doing in 2022 when I started in data engineering 20 years ago. So I worked in New York and was the business owner for, in the early 2000s, was the business owner for one of the largest data warehouses anywhere in the world at the time. It wouldn't even be considered big data today, but it was very, very big and very significant back then. And what we had as an organization was almost unlimited budgets to spend on our data capabilities and our oversight and our data engineering. We didn't call it data engineering back then, but our data capabilities. Because we'd been done for a class action in the mid-90s, and so we had the opportunity to invest significantly in tech. We had all the best tools. We had all the vendors were helping us out. Like, we had IBM in regularly telling us we were sort of at the bleeding edge of what people were doing. But I still had a team of 30 analysts pushing Excel and Access uphill to drive our organization and our business and the overall outcomes. Now, they'd take extracts from our data warehouse and then manipulate them to meet the business needs. Does that sound familiar? Anybody else see those types of situations where you do all this work to create a massive pipeline and then your users take it offline and do a bunch of extra work on the other side, right? And the actual data product they're using, the actual value that they're getting, is divorced from your data process, right? So I didn't think in 2000 when I was doing this work, in 2006 when I started my company, that in 2022, Excel would still be driving businesses and outcomes. And it is. There's no question about it. What I envisaged, so it was the early 2000s, it was the dot-com boom and bust, it was sort of the excitement about the digital age, the idea of internet connectivity changing the world was sort of massive in our sort of zeitgeist. I thought, wow, in the future, in the exchange of goods and services, information will be freely flowing. We'll be able to make purchase decisions based on values and judgment and things like that. And I sort of had this vision for radical transparency. Now, that vision was shared by folks. If you look sort of at the articles from that period, the mid-2000s, there's all sorts of people sort of predicting radical transparency is going to change the world. But I worked in an organization where even though we had almost unlimited funding for tech and data engineering and data capability, we still had a mess. So this is where I'm leaning on our sewage and plumbing analogy. We had just had shit, right? And it was a mess even though we had almost unlimited spending. My view is it's gotten worse, if not better. And the reason it's gotten worse is because the technology stacks are evolving so quickly, and we're not building the operational disciplines necessary to have the kind of factory that delivers clean water as opposed to sewage. And we don't have that structurally across the organization, right? So I told you I was going to lean hard into this data plumbing analogy, right? So please forgive me on that. But that sort of thinking is what I think we need as we start to look at addressing some of the existential challenges. We need to actually get our house in orders to drive the kinds of change we need to see in the world. If you imagine, if all of a sudden, well, we saw what happened with Optus when they left open an open API, right? You just can't have that happen. And so you have to think about how you're going to share information and build that out over time. So I've talked a little bit about sort of that data plumbing, sort of building your internal trust, and sort of then building readiness to build external trust. So I actually want to go into a little bit of detail about how you, on your day-to-day jobs, can build some of that internal trust in data. And so, so how do you engineer data into your pipelines? And so I have a couple of things, and this comes from sort of this industrial engineering concept that we've talked about, is build simple tech-agnostic patterns. Joe had on his sort of here's what data engineering slide is, data comes in, something happens in the middle, we do business logic or whatever, and there's data consumption on the other side. That is the majority of, that's the base pattern of data engineering from my perspective. You have a pipe, water comes in one side, water comes out the other side, same, the analogy's holding so far. There's a bunch of other things as well, but basically that simple pattern becomes the basis of the rest of your patterns and analysis. The second thing is build operational rigor into all of your pipelines, right? So the thing about plumbing and sewage is it doesn't matter if 80% of your pipelines are clean. As soon as you have one that's bad, you have a problem, right? It might be a risk vector for a data leakage for your organization. It might be undermining trust in your overall ecosystem because data is not showing up on time, it's not correct, it's not reflective of reality. So how do you build that operational rigor all the time? You can't, every time you have exceptions, you're asking for challenges and a mess. And so I have a saying in my organization, people on my team don't like the saying, but it's one I'll share with you, which is, if there are two ways to do the same thing, they're both wrong. Get it to one. Because once you can get it to one, you can start improving that process. You can say, hey, that process isn't working effectively. Let's fix this. Let's address this. Let's get it faster. Let's get it more efficient. If you have two, you go, oh, maybe we should do it that. Like you don't have the ability to create that continuous improvement model. The third thing is instrument your data pipelines. So I'm going to keep leaning on my plumbing analogy. It's really easy to know when your plumbing is broken in your house, right? You're either wet or something smells. But in our data pipelines, we don't have that same ability, right? We don't necessarily know if they were successful or not, if they failed, if they should have run and just didn't. All of those things become an important part of that. And the way that starts to build trust is if you can go to your customer or the person who's extracting value from this data pipeline and say, hey, I know there's a problem. I've got a team working on it. We'll get it fixed. We'll let you know as soon as it's done. That changes the engagement with your customer from, shit, my data's broken again. I'm sorry, I'm swearing a lot today up here. I hope nobody's offended. But I get passionate about this stuff. And then, as you've built these things, is share metrics, SLAs, and progress on how the data pipelines are performing individually and aggregate. You've got to share and build that collaboration with the people who are getting value out of this over time. And that creates a feedback loop to build that continuous improvement cycle across your pipeline ecosystem. And it's a mess still, right? Because you have to work with infrastructure teams, security teams, help desks, architecture teams, application teams, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You just have to start building this consistent pattern and just keep turning the handle. The thing here is it's much more about maintenance and maintaining these ecosystems than it is about building the sexy new stuff. If you can build that maintenance into your ecosystem, you have a chance to start cleaning up the data and moving into that next level. And the way we do that, and this is where my slide mirrors Joe's a little bit, is you have your sort of, the base pattern of your pipelines, data comes in, and whether you're accessing it in place or moving it to a new location, that data acquisition piece, this is where you need to understand things like, how are we connecting to the data? Are we encrypted in motion? Are we putting it somewhere? Is it going to be encrypted at rest? Like all of those kinds of things sort of sit there. Business logic, this is all the things we do to our data. Why are we touching it? What are we doing with it? And then data consumption, that might be an API endpoint, it might be a machine learning model, it might be all sorts of things. And these things then string together and you get a sort of, oftentimes get a long, long string of these patterns repeated over and over and over again. Then of course, the next piece of this is it all sits on infrastructure, right? So you have to have a clear understanding of the infrastructure these pipelines are sitting on and how it's managed and how it's maintained. And notice if your infrastructure is falling over, right? So we all sort of work in tech. The most in my experience over 15 years, still today, the most likely cause of a data engineering pipeline failure is the disk runs out of space. How predictable is that? How easy is that, if you set up your operational processes, how easy is that to be in front of? And if you don't, it's going to bite you, for sure. How many people have had a disk space problem cause a pipeline problem, right? Everybody. It happens. So if you're going to build trust in data, you've got to solve these known problems. And you've got to solve them repeatably and scalably and make sure that they're in place. It might not be your team that's responsible, but this is where I have another phrase, which is, it may not be your fault, but because you're the pipeline owner, it's your problem. And so you've got to be in front of these things to build that trust in data. I've got a couple more that are sort of more engineering or sort of data engineering specific things. Lifecycle management, governance, data map. How do these little sort of small pipelines link together to make a big chain? Software development lifecycle. I keep that separate from pipeline lifecycle because what your operating system upgrades, your tool upgrades, your vendor saying, hey, we're gonna stop supporting that release of Postgres. You're gonna have to upgrade to here. All of that is sort of different to your pipeline lifecycle management. Service levels are really important because, again, if you're in front of service levels, if you can be faster than the business your customer wants, then you're sort of addressing their problems before you get there. And the final one we have, or not the final one, training and enablement. So make sure that the people who are interacting with these ecosystems can use them in this consistent way that we're talking about. It's very easy for somebody new coming into an ecosystem to go, oh, I don't like the way they do that. I'm going to go do something brand new over here. And as soon as you do that, you've created a new piece of legacy. And then you build, and you see that repeat over and over and over again, and that's what creates that messy pipeline ecosystem that we're talking about. And of course, the big one, anybody want to guess what the big one is? Nobody? Security. You've got to secure your pipelines. You've got to be in front of this. You can't be creating risk for your organization. It creates a mess. So this is our methodology. You can use Joe's. This is the one we use to sort of apply those 3 principles that I talked about across the ecosystem to build that consistent continuous improvement model. And we built this off of our understanding of breaking it into its constituent parts so that we can build it up into a cohesive data operations service. And so we call it our data engineering methodology with a consistent operational model. It's that consistent operational model that makes us work. It's not the methodology, it's the model. It's making it operational, making it consistent. And this is where some of the industrial engineering thinking comes in. So that's how I sort of have worked and built, worked to build trust in our data engineering pipelines is by looking at it. Now, do we get all of these right every day? No. We've had disk space runs out, even with monitoring in place, like it happens. But this gives us a way of knowing it in advance and working in front of what the customer is expecting as opposed to reacting to the customer's needs. And that's what builds that trust in data from our perspective. And this is how we build trust for our customers and for our clients, candidly for ourselves. We're a customer of our own operational methodology inside of our organization for our own data, right? And so that's kind of the internal trust that we're talking about. That's sort of the data plumbing work and building trust for ourselves and our customers. Now, I sort of told the origin story where I sort of imagined radical transparency changing the world. Has it happened? I don't know if anybody's noticed. But there's some work that's being done that I'm really excited about. And so this is kind of building external trust. And this is where I think there's an opportunity, if you start building that internal trust, to help your organizations build a competitive differentiation and a competitive advantage as the world is changing massively quickly. Like there's going to be massive changes over the next 5 years. For better or for worse, it's coming. And so what I want to talk a little bit about building external trust. Now, the reality here is you can't build external trust if you don't have your house in order. If you have a bunch of leaky pipes, you're going to be creating a mess. But some places where we see building engineering external trust, so I've got some advice here. I don't have quite the same rigor as I do in sort of building the internal trust, but share using open standards. Don't get yourself tied to vendors. Use open standards. We're working with the UNCFACT, which is the standards body for trade in Europe, to build an international protocol around sharing data across borders. It's going to use verifiable credentials and distributed identity capabilities that is sort of in the W3C standard. These things are just emerging. It's really exciting stuff and potentially gives us the ability to share data in a protected, sovereign, manageable way. It's cool things. Don't overshare. Like, just because you have some data doesn't mean you should open up an API to everything. And share where it provides your organization competitive differentiation. PII information is not yours to share unless you've gotten explicit permission and it's a business model or business choice. Be careful about that. Don't go it alone. Collaborate with industry bodies. If you go it alone, you can kind of get stuck on a limb. And don't outsource your sharing. If you're going to try to build competitive advantage by the data capabilities that you've built inside your organization, make sure you own that and own that sort of capability. If you're helping your customers, your business teams build competitive advantage, you want to make sure that's something that your organization owns and maintains. And apply these same engineering patterns to your external data sharing as well as the same ones as you did in your internal patterns as you do to your external. I have a little bit of a typo there, sorry about that. So tech agnostic patterns, operational rigor, and instrumentation are kind of the three things that you apply consistently to build that trust, both internally and externally. All right, so what I've got here is sort of the idea of we build our plumbing and we build our data plumbing, we build our internal trust, we make sure that our internal plumbing systems, gray water and bad water don't mix together. And we then sort of share that with the sewage ecosystem and the broader world cleaning ecosystem, and builds that. So by building our internal trust, sharing it externally, building our pipelines correctly internally, and connecting with the sort of global ecosystems that we're starting to see emerge, we can, as data engineers, be the superheroes of changing the world. I'm excited about our industry. I'm excited about us maturing. So what I want to leave you with is the idea that by building trust inside of our organizations, applying industrial engineering rigor to our data engineering capabilities, we can start building the competitive differentiation for our businesses and have the kind of impact on the world that I think data and information can. And that's mostly it. It's one of the most, anyway. So I'm working on building a community of communities, particularly around that international data sharing piece. And I think data engineering is the linchpin of making the kind of impact. I still believe that building radical transparency, maybe not the way I envisaged it in 2006, is still a way of making a dent in the world. And I think we're the profession to do it. Any questions?
Firstly, thank you for not using the analogy of going to the bathroom to do some data entry. A lot of these concepts across a bunch of these talks that I'm seeing. So my background's in DevOps. A lot of these concepts are concepts that have been around the DevOps world for a while. Where DevOps is starting to move to is towards platform engineering, backed by a lot of new open standards and SIG groups and things like that, where decisions are made in the open as a collective. How far off do you see the data engineering practice from reaching that sort of level of open collaboration as well? Because it all seems to be very happening behind closed doors and then suddenly appears on the scene from what I'm seeing.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So a lot of the principles we apply here and the way we do a lot of this comes straight off of DevOps. And because a lot of sort of managing security, managing infrastructure, all the monitoring stuff that we do all comes out of the DevOps practice. And so the thing that I see in data engineering is we oftentimes think we're special because there's unique problems in the space. Data size is very, like sort of density is a very big different problem in the data engineering space compared to the software application development space. Like there's a density problem that we face and some of the encryption stuff. In terms of things showing up on the scene, I think that's been a evolution of the business models to support data engineering as opposed to the community. And I think it's been sort of the tech industry business models associated with big data, software as a service, all those kind of ecosystems are kind of eating the community's lunch a little bit. Sorry, vendors, so the place where I'd say, but I think a lot of folks here, when they sort of start building the applications, can pull from DevOps. And also the sort of global sharing stuff that we're doing with the UNC fact and stuff like that, that's all being done out in the open, out in a collaborative environment. And so I think we might see a convergence over time, but that's a journey. And I think part of that is just the maturation of the data engineering profession into something that's a little bit more formalized. And I'd say we're probably 15 years behind the DevOps community, or maybe 5 to 10 years behind the DevOps community in terms of building that kind of ecosystem out. Yep.
Zach, thanks so much for sharing all your knowledge with us. I got a question regarding, I saw you highlighted like ISO 27001. For an organization which is global, how do we start? Is adhering to 27001 ISO standards going to satisfy all the the best practices in managing our data, and what's the best way to start to approach that? Because our data engineering practice is, still relatively nascent,
Yep.
and so and a lot of the companies still is, relatively. A lot of the other engineers also needs to be sort of upskilled or something into better data literacy and management skills. Yeah.
Yep. So the ISO 27001 kind of was a cost of doing business for us. I don't think it's the best standard for, it's kind of the standard for data security, but we got it, and actually what the auditor said to us is he'd never seen an organization operationalize their ISMS or their ISO 27000 program the way we had. And so one of the things when we talk about operational rigor and building security into the way we think about things, finding those repeatable patterns, building operational rigor into them, and then instrumenting it, all that stuff existed organizationally before we got our certification. And so it's about actually how do you manage the process as opposed to the specific tech that solves that problem, or the specific oversight, or the specific checks. So there's lots of different certifications you can get. So what I would do is get started and build a data security guild or practice or team or collaboration or something that just starts that journey around operationalization, rigor, and patterns and instrumentation, so that you start to have something and then build from there. I would not go for an ISO certification from the beginning. I would wait. I just start the practice, start getting it repeatable, start getting your security into one pattern, and probably now it's several, right? And it's probably as many as you have team members is probably the number of security patterns you have currently, if you haven't focused on it yet.
I think that's about all we have for time, but maybe one last round of applause to thank Zach.
Thanks, everyone.